War is good for the economy. You hear people say this all the time. The biggest example people like to use is World War II. They say that World War II ended the Great Depression because factories ramped up production to sell weapons overseas. And that resulted in millions of people getting jobs and the economy exploded. The logic is that war creates massive government spending. That spending creates jobs and the economy grows. But there's a problem with that story. Over the last 2 decades, the United States spent roughly $8 trillion fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those wars did not create an economic boom. In fact, they happened during one of the worst economic periods in American history. So that raises a much bigger question. If war is supposed to stimulate the economy, why hasn't it been working? So let's start with why people believe war is good for the economy. When the government massively increases military spending, it injects billions, if not trillions of dollars into the economy. It typically starts off with the Department of Defense hiring more soldiers, then defense contractors get massive contracts. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and they start to ramp up production. Factories start producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition. Those defense companies then buy more material from suppliers, so steel producers, electronic manufacturers, fuel companies. All of this extra demand in all of these sectors cause companies to start hiring massive amounts of new workers and raising wages because there's so much profits being made. So during these times, you hardly see any unemployment and workers have a lot more money, and those workers go spend that money in the broader economy. So you start to see consumer spending rise as well. And from the outside, it looks like an economic boom. The most famous example of this is World War II. In 1940, defense spending was only about 1.4% of the US economy, and unemployment was still close to 10%. But by 1945, when America got involved in the war, defense spending exploded to 41% of GDP, unemployment fell below 2%, and economic output surged. The war mobilized the entire country. About 16 million Americans served in the military, women started entering the workforce in huge numbers, factories across the country converted to war production, but here's the most important part most people forget. Civilian production largely stopped. Basically what that means is there were no new cars being built, almost no new houses being built, a lot of consumer goods disappeared from store shelves, food, gasoline, and basic supplies were rationed because we needed everything for the war effort. So yes, people had jobs and incomes, but there was a lot less things to actually spend money on. But still, you did see GDP skyrocket. And because of that, a lot of people concluded that war ended the Great Depression and created an economic boom. And that's where the idea that war is good for the economy really comes from. But for all the benefits to the economy during World War II, there were a lot of hidden costs people couldn't see until years later. And now, looking back, here's what actually happened during World War II. Even though GDP was rising, the normal economy was shrinking. Consumption, the amount people spend on everyday goods, fell from about 67% of the economy to 46%. Private investment collapsed from 11% to just 3%. Basically, yes, people had jobs and incomes from war production, but there was very little to actually buy. Majority of civilian goods were rationed or simply unavailable because we had to send everything to the war effort. There were no new cars, there were no new home, there was limited food, fuel, and consumer goods. So government war spending, it didn't add to the normal economy, it mostly replaced it. Instead of people buying cars, houses, and appliances, the government was buying tanks, bombs, and ships. And all of that came with enormous debt. During the war, the federal deficit reached 27.5% of GDP, and total government debt climbed to over 100% of the entire economy. Taxes were raised dramatically to help pay for it. At the time, the top tax rate reached 94%, and federal tax revenue more than doubled as a share of the economy. And even with massive mobilization, economists estimate the economic impact was smaller than most people think. One estimate from economist Robert Barrow found that every dollar of wartime spending increased GDP by only about 60 cents. That means roughly 40 cents of normal private economic activity was crowded out. And once the war ended, economic growth simply returned to its pre-war trend. In other words, the war created a temporary surge in production, not permanent economic growth. And remember, World War II was actually the best case scenario for war economically. The US started with massive unused capacity from the Great Depression, millions of unemployed workers, and the fighting happened overseas, so American infrastructure wasn't destroyed. Even under those ideal conditions, war still wasn't as economically beneficial as people believe. Now, the wars the United States has fought in the modern era, the economic impact has been completely different. After the September 11 attacks, the US launched wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and expanded the broader war on terror. Over the next 2 decades, those wars were some of the most expensive in American history. The total cost on the war on terror was about $8 trillion, roughly $2.3 trillion for Afghanistan, about $2.1 trillion for Iraq, and hundreds of billions more for other military operations across the Middle East and Africa. Another $1 trillion went into the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11. And the long-term costs keep growing even when the wars end. Veterans care alone is expected to cost over $2 trillion through 2050. And interest payments on the debt used to finance these wars will add another $1 trillion or more. By the 2030s, the United States may spend as much on interest as it did on the wars themselves. But here's the biggest difference from World War II. These wars were almost entirely financed by borrowing. There were no major tax increases to pay for them. In fact, taxes were cut multiple times in 2001, 2003, and again in 2017. That's extremely unusual in American history. Previous wars were typically financed through a combination of higher taxes, spending cuts elsewhere, and war bonds. But the post-9/11 wars were largely pushed off the normal federal budget. For years, much of the war spending was approved through emergency appropriations with limited oversight and transparency. And despite all of that spending, the wars did not produce an economic boom. At its peak in 2011, defense spending reached about 5.5% of the US economy. Compare that to 41% during World War II. And in the middle of these wars, the United States experienced the 2008 financial crisis, the worst recession since the Depression. There's another opportunity cost of war people don't talk about either, and that is, for every dollar spent on war, that's a dollar not spent somewhere else. Military spending creates roughly 5 to 7 jobs for every $1 million spent. But if that same $1 million were spent somewhere else in the economy, it would create far more jobs. For example, education spending creates about 19 jobs per million, healthcare creates about 14 jobs, infrastructure creates about 10 jobs, and clean energy creates about 8 jobs. In other words, the exact same amount of money could create far more employment depending on where it's spent. The reason for that is because military spending is extremely capital intensive. Building a fighter jet requires expensive materials, advanced machinery, and complex technology. That means a large share of the money goes into equipment, not labor. Defense supply chains are also global, meaning some of that spending leaks overseas. But sectors like education, healthcare, and infrastructure are far more labor intensive and largely domestic. They hire more people per dollar spent. Now, think about the scale of this. The United States spent roughly $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars. If that same $8 trillion had been spent on education instead, economists estimate it would have created about 3 million more jobs. If it was spent on healthcare, roughly 2 million more jobs. If it was spent on infrastructure, about 1.5 million more jobs. And these jobs would have produced things that actually make the economy more productive over time. Things like better schools, a healthier workforce, or roads and bridges that lower costs for businesses. Instead, that money largely went into war spending. And what we were left with was more debt and decades of future obligations for veterans care. So if war isn't actually good for the overall economy, who benefits from it? The biggest winners are defense contractors, companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. These companies receive enormous government contracts to build fighter jets, missiles, ships, and military equipment. Between 2020 and 2024 alone, the Pentagon awarded about $2.4 trillion in contracts. This accounted for more than half of its discretionary spending. That money ultimately flows to shareholder executives and a relatively small number of highly specialized workers. But per dollar spent, it creates far fewer jobs than spending on things like education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Take Lockheed Martin as an example. In 2023, the company generated about $67 billion in revenue, and roughly 3/4 of that came directly from US government contracts. Its CEO earned around $27 million that year, and the political influence around defense spending is massive. Defense contractors spend hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying and campaign donations. Lockheed Martin alone spent over $12 million lobbying the US government in 2023. This creates something that people call the revolving door effect. Military generals retire and they join defense contractor boards. Pentagon officials leave government jobs and they become defense lobbyists. And executives from defense companies, they sometimes move into government positions overseeing the very contracts their companies receive. The result is a system where defense spending becomes deeply entrenched and very difficult to reduce, even when certain weapon programs are outdated or inefficient. President Dwight Eisenhower warned about this in his dynamic 1961 farewell speech. He called it the military-industrial complex and warned that we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. Those were his words. And here's another surprising detail. Even regions heavily dependent on military manufacturing, they don't necessarily become more prosperous. One study found that among 20 US states most dependent on military manufacturing, 14 had poverty rates at or above the national average. Defense dependence, it doesn't even necessarily create broad prosperity. In many cases, it simply creates economic dependence on government military spending. So the idea that war is good for the economy, it comes from what we see in the short term, which is rising production, falling unemployment, and booming defense industries. But when people look at the full picture, the story is very different. War shifts resources away from more productive parts of the economy, it creates massive long-term debt, and it concentrates the benefits in a small number of industries, and it destroys the lives of many American people.